September 3rd, 1955. Detective Ray Morrison's hand trembled as he reached for his handcuffs. The Cotton Club was packed wall to wall. 200 of Harlem's most influential people watching his every move. Politicians, musicians, businessmen, hustlers, all eyes on table 7, where Bumpy Johnson sat calmly cutting his steak, as if a white detective hadn't just announced his arrest warrant in the middle of Harlem's most sacred space. Morrison had been planning this moment for 3 months, the perfect setup, maximum humiliation. Break Bumpy's mystique in front of his own people, show them their king could bleed like any other man. But as Morrison stood there, badge glinting under the amber lights, something in the air shifted. The jazz band had stopped mid-note. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the waiters had frozen with plates in their hands. Bumpy looked up from his plate, made eye contact with Morrison, and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a defiant smile. Something else entirely. Something that made Morrison's throat go dry. "You sure about this, detective?" Bumpy's voice was quiet, conversational, but it carried through that silent room like it was amplified. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Detective Ray Morrison was in 1955. He wasn't some dirty cop on Bumpy's payroll. He was clean, ambitious, and hungry to make a name for himself. Morrison had transferred to Harlem 6 months earlier with a mission from Commissioner Kennedy himself. Bring down Bumpy Johnson. Morrison had done his homework. He'd studied Bumpy's operation, mapped his associates, tracked his money. He had evidence of tax evasion, enough to put Bumpy away for 5 to 10 years. But Morrison wanted more than a conviction. He wanted to destroy the myth. Bumpy Johnson's power in Harlem wasn't just about money or muscle. It was about respect, about the belief that he was untouchable. Morrison understood that if he could arrest Bumpy publicly, if he could humiliate him in front of his own community, he wouldn't just be taking down a criminal, he'd be dismantling an empire built on reputation. The Cotton Club on Saturday night was perfect for Morrison's plan. Bumpy held court there every weekend, surrounded by Harlem's elite. Everyone who mattered would be watching. Morrison had timed everything perfectly. 9:47 p.m., right when the club hit maximum capacity, right when Bumpy would be most vulnerable to public embarrassment. But what Morrison didn't understand about Bumpy Johnson was this: the man had never been vulnerable a day in his life. Not when he was 12 years old fighting grown men in Charleston, not when he went to prison for the first time at 19, and certainly not now, at 50. Sitting in his own kingdom with 2 decades of carefully built power behind him.
Morrison wasn't just ambitious. He'd grown up poor in Hell's Kitchen, watched his old man bust his ass 16 hours a day while local criminals drove Cadillacs. Morrison joined the force believing honest work should beat criminal shortcuts. When he first arrived in Harlem, he'd expected to find typical street thugs. Instead, he discovered something that challenged everything he believed about justice. The numbers operation Bumpy controlled wasn't just illegal gambling. It was the only reliable financial system available to people the legitimate banks ignored. The protection services he provided weren't simple extortion. They were genuine security for businesses the police couldn't or wouldn't defend adequately. Bumpy set down his knife and fork, dabbed his mouth with a white cloth napkin, and stood up slowly. He was not a tall man, 5'8", but something about the way he moved made the entire room feel smaller. Morrison's backup officers positioned near the exits suddenly looked uncertain. They'd come prepared for resistance, for violence, for anything except this suffocating quiet. "Detective Morrison," Bumpy said, his voice still conversational, "you've been asking questions about me for months. Following my associates, talking to my neighbors." He paused, straightening his tie. "Did you really think I didn't know?" Morrison's jaw clenched. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Bumpy was supposed to be surprised, off balance. Instead, he seemed almost amused. "Ellsworth Johnson," Morrison announced loudly, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for federal tax evasion and conspiracy to..." "Stop." That single word from Bumpy cut through Morrison's speech like a blade. Detective actually stopped talking, handcuffs halfway out of their case. Something in Bumpy's tone, not threatening, not angry, just absolutely certain, had made him pause instinctively. Bumpy walked around his table, moving not toward Morrison, but toward the center of the room. 200 people watched him move through their midst, like Moses parting the sea. Politicians who he avoided being seen with him didn't look away. Musicians who'd been performing all night put down their instruments. Business owners who'd never acknowledged his presence publicly now stared openly. Detective Morrison has something he wants to say to all of you. Bumpy announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the club. He wants to arrest me, here, tonight, in front of my friends, my neighbors, my community. Bumpy's eyes swept the room. He wants to show you that your respect for me is misplaced, that your trust in me is foolish. Morrison felt the weight of 200 stares shifting to him. This was not the dynamic he'd planned. He was supposed to be the one in control, the law bringing justice to lawlessness. Instead, he felt like an intruder in a courtroom, where Bumpy was both judge and jury. The warrant is valid, Morrison said, but his voice sounded smaller now. The charges are real.
Oh, I doubt that, Bumpy replied. Commissioner Kennedy has been very thorough, very creative with his accounting, very motivated to find anything to justify what he really wants to do. Bumpy turned to face Morrison directly. Which is not to enforce the law, detective. It's to break something he can't control. Here's what nobody knew. What Morrison sure as hell didn't know. Bumpy had been ready for this moment for 3 weeks. Not because he had inside information. Though he did. Not because he had corrupt cops feeding him intelligence. Though he had those too. Bumpy had been preparing because he understood something about power that Morrison never would. Real power? It's knowing when to take the hit. 3 weeks earlier, Bumpy had received word through his network that federal investigators were closing in. Any other criminal would have panicked, started destroying evidence, moving money offshore. But Bumpy had called a meeting with his oldest advisor, a man named Solomon who taught him everything about reading situations and people. They're coming for you, Bumpy told him. Course they are, Solomon replied, not looking up from his chess game. Question is, you gonna run like a punk or face it like a king? That conversation changed everything for Bumpy. He realized his arrest was inevitable. But his response wasn't. He could run like a common criminal. Or he could face it like a king. 3 weeks earlier, Bumpy had sat in his lawyer's office reviewing the tax case. The evidence was solid. The charges would likely stick. Any other criminal would have run, hidden assets, fled the country. But Bumpy saw opportunity where others saw disaster. If they arrest me publicly, he told his lawyer, what message does that send? That they caught you, the lawyer had replied. No, Bumpy had said quietly. That they had to bring the entire weight of the federal government to bear against one man from Harlem. That despite all their resources, all their power, all their investigation, they still had to resort to tax technicalities to touch me. Bumpy had spent those 3 weeks preparing his community for what was coming, not through speeches or meetings, but through action. He'd paid medical bills for families who couldn't afford them. He'd prevented evictions through quiet conversations with landlords. He'd resolved conflicts between rival groups before they turned violent. He'd reminded Harlem, through deed rather than word, exactly what they would be losing if he disappeared. Now, standing in the Cotton Club facing Detective Morrison, Bumpy was ready to turn his arrest into something else entirely. Into a demonstration of the difference between authority and respect. Detective, Bumpy said, extending his hands toward Morrison. You have your warrant. You have your job to do. I understand that, but before you put those handcuffs on me, I want everyone in this room to understand something. Morrison hesitated. Every instinct told him to slap the cuffs on immediately, to end this speech before Bumpy could manipulate the situation further. But 200 people were watching, waiting. Morrison was trapped in Bumpy's theater, whether he wanted to be or not. This man, Bumpy continued, gesturing toward Morrison, represents a system that has never cared about Harlem except when it wanted to take something from us. Our money through taxes we pay, but services we never see. Our sons through wars we never chose. Our dignity through laws that protect everyone except us. His voice remained calm, measured. Detective Morrison isn't here because I'm a threat to justice. He's here because I'm a threat to their comfort. Morrison felt the mood in the room shifting like a tide. When he'd walked in, he'd been a representative of law and order confronting a criminal. Now he felt like something else. An outsider challenging a man who belonged here in ways Morrison never could. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet anymore. It was expected. 200 people waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve itself. Morrison realized he was no longer arresting a criminal. He was challenging a king in front of his subjects. But Bumpy wasn't finished. He turned away from Morrison and addressed the room directly. Some of you knew me when I was nobody. When I was just another angry young man from the South trying to survive in a city that didn't want me. You've seen me build something here, not just for myself, but for all of us. Morrison watched as heads nodded throughout the crowd. Politicians, musicians, business owners. People who should have been embarrassed to be associated with a criminal. Instead looked like they were listening to their congressman. When your businesses needed protection from people who wanted to destroy them,
Who did you call? Bumpy continued. When your children needed someone to talk sense into them before they made mistakes that would ruin their lives. Who stepped up? When the police harassed you for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Who made the phone calls that made it stop? Morrison felt his authority evaporating with each question. He'd come to arrest a criminal and found himself confronting a community leader. The distinction shouldn't have mattered. Crime was crime, law was law. But in this room at this moment it mattered completely. Detective Morrison is going to arrest me now, Bumpy announced. And he should. He has his orders. And he's going to follow them. But I want all of you to remember something while I'm gone. He looked around the room one final time. Power isn't about avoiding consequences. It's about accepting them with dignity. It's about showing your community that some things are worth sacrificing for. Bumpy turned back to Morrison and extended his hands again. I'm ready, Detective. Morrison stood there for a long moment, handcuffs in his hand, facing a man who had somehow transformed his own arrest into a coronation. The detective looked around the room and saw 200 people who weren't watching justice being served. They were watching their leader being taken from them by a system they already didn't trust.
Morrison got it then. Completely screwed. He could arrest Bumpy, but he couldn't arrest what Bumpy meant to these people. Hell, he was about to make him stronger. But Morrison had no choice. He'd come this far, made his intentions public. Backing down now would destroy his career and hand Bumpy an even greater victory. With shaking hands, Morrison approached Bumpy and placed the handcuffs around his wrists. The click of the metal locking echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Ellsworth Johnson, Morrison said formally. You're under arrest. Bumpy nodded calmly. Thank you for your professionalism, Detective. He looked out at the crowd one last time. I'll be back, he said simply. As Morrison led Bumpy toward the exit, something extraordinary happened. One by one, every person in that room stood up. Not in protest, not in anger, but in respect. 200 people rising silently as their leader was taken away. Politicians risking their careers. Business owners risking their reputations. Musicians risking their gigs. All of them standing for a man who had chosen dignity over escape. Morrison felt the weight of those stares. As he walked Bumpy through the crowd, he'd thought he was making an arrest. Instead, he was participating in a ceremony, a ritual that would be talked about in Harlem for decades. Outside the Cotton Club, as Morrison placed Bumpy in the back of his police car, Bumpy spoke quietly so only the detective could hear. You're a good cop, Morrison. Honest. Dedicated. You believe in what you're doing. He paused. But you don't attend this neighborhood. You don't understand what you just did in there. Morrison slammed the car door harder than necessary. He'd gotten his arrest, but it felt like defeat. As the police car pulled away from the Cotton Club, Morrison could see people still standing in the windows, still watching their leader disappear into the night. Bumpy Johnson served 18 months in federal prison for tax evasion. During that time, his organization didn't fall apart. Crime in Harlem didn't decrease. His influence didn't diminish. If anything, the story of his arrest, how he'd turned humiliation into triumph, became legend. Detective Morrison's career never recovered. Despite making the arrest he'd been ordered to make, despite following procedure perfectly, he was quietly transferred out of Harlem 6 months later. The community had never forgiven him for taking their king, and the police department had never forgiven him for making their efforts look petty and vindictive. When Bumpy was released from prison in 1957, he returned to Harlem to find his power intact and his reputation enhanced. The night of his arrest had proven something to his community that no amount of success could have. That he would sacrifice his freedom rather than his dignity, his comfort rather than his principles.
Years later, a reporter asked Commissioner Kennedy if he regretted ordering Bumpy's public arrest. Kennedy thought for a long moment before answering. We wanted to prove he could be touched, he said finally. Instead, we proved he couldn't be broken. The arrest of Bumpy Johnson at the Cotton Club became more than just a moment in criminal justice history. It became a masterclass in the difference between authority and respect, between power imposed and power earned. Morrison had all the authority that law and government could provide. Bumpy had something more valuable, the voluntary respect of a community that saw him as their defender. That night in the Cotton Club, 200 people learned something about leadership that no civics class could have taught them. Real leaders don't avoid difficult moments. They use them to demonstrate their character. They don't hide from consequences. They accept them with grace and turn them into statements. The story hit Harlem streets like lightning. By morning, every corner in the neighborhood was buzzing. How Bumpy turned his arrest into a masterclass. How he showed everyone what dignity looked like. How some things respect principle can't be handcuffed. Morrison would spend the rest of his career trying to understand what had happened in that room. He'd achieved his objective completely and failed utterly at the same time. The silence that followed Morrison's announcement wasn't terrifying because it was threatening. It was terrifying because it was absolute. 200 people unified in their understanding that they were witnessing something historic. The arrest of their king and his transformation of defeat into victory. Morrison felt something shift in his chest as he stood there with those handcuffs. He'd walked into the Cotton Club thinking he was ending a criminal career. Instead, he'd become part of a legend he didn't understand. Every person in that room would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Would tell their children and grandchildren about the night Bumpy Johnson chose dignity over freedom. The detective realized with growing dread that he hadn't just failed to humiliate Bumpy, he'd elevated him. Morrison had wanted to prove that Bumpy could be touched like any other man. Instead, he'd proven that even when touched, even when arrested, Bumpy Johnson remained untouchable in the ways that mattered most. Morrison thought he was ending Bumpy's reign that night. Instead, he was cementing it forever.